Bonjour tout le monde. My only French, I apologize in advance. I was explaining to Jean-Marc this morning at my grammar school. I had a scholarship to go to the school, but I was taught French grammar, so past historic, perfect tense, imperfect tense, future tense, everything, but they never thought we might need to speak French. So I apologize, so I'll be speaking in English. I'd just like to begin to thank you for inviting me to come to speak in Quebec. I received the email from Jocelyn, and I was, whoa, that sounds exciting. And then we had an online meeting with Jean-Marc, Marc-André and Jocelyn, and they really brought over what you're trying to do over here and work, and then they explained about the 20th anniversary, and I was so flattered to be invited. So I've been thinking about it ever since and really excited, and it's giving me the theme really for my next book. So I'll be forever grateful for that. And the theme, taking a step back to rethink leisure, is mightily important to me. Okay then, so I'm going to offer 13 ways of looking at leisure. Okay, first of all, this is from a poem by Wallace Stevens, the modernist American poet. I call Wallace Stevens a poet philosopher because I think much of his work is very philosophical in orientation. And so I borrowed this idea from Wallace Stevens. So what I want to do, what I'd argue is what sets apart looking from merely seeing is the difference between how an idea or a concept or a blackbird, if you like, appears when we try to isolate it from life, and how it appears when we place ourselves in the world from which it emerges. And that's my first point, or that comes from this poem, if you like. We need to place ourselves in the world of the blackbird to understand the blackbird's world. And if we need to understand leisure in a changed modern world, which I've described as a liquid modern world, and I'll talk about that in a moment, we need to place ourselves in that world to try to explain it. So that's the first thing that I'm going to try and do. The second thing that I think comes from Stevens is that looking at leisure in the way that Stevens does looks at it as the effect of a parallax view. And by a parallax view, what we mean is if we look at things from different positions, we tend to see different things. And in this important poem, what I think that Stevens is suggesting, that we need to see the world from a blackbird's perspective. But of course, we're not blackbirds, we're human beings. So what that does, it conjures up, we need to use our imaginations. We need to think at leisure, if you like. And that's what I'm going to try and do today. So, but before I set out what I think are my 13 ways of looking at leisure, I briefly want to talk about this idea of a shift from a solid modern world to a light and liquid software modern world, if you like. And, you know, the key theorist, anybody who's sort of read any of my work will know that I've been massively influenced by the Polish-British sociologist Zygmunt Bauman. And he used these two metaphors, if you like, solidity and liquidity, to try to explore a modern world. And when I think about the sort of, when I was first introduced to leisure, and I was doing my undergraduate degree, it was very much, you'll be familiar with a lot of the ideas that, you know, we were introduced to the idea of leisure as time left over from work. We were introduced to leisure as a set of activities. We were introduced to leisure as something that was functional, if you like. It's functional for the economy. It's functional in an educative sense. And of course, we were introduced to leisure as freedom. But what was quite interesting for me is, and the sort of critical way in which we looked at leisure, was from this whole idea, well, it's leisure in a modern world. And if we look at where the modern world came from, you know, the Enlightenment, the birth of the Industrial Revolution, the way in which industrial production started to shape our lives from the beginning of the modern world. They were the same processes that influenced leisure and those sort of ideas of thinking about leisure that we are all familiar with. The way in which, the world of industrial production created a class society, and the way in which a class society, I always have trouble with that word, shaped the way that we see and think about leisure. But what I want to argue today is that the world that we live in today, what Bauman describes as liquid modern, is that something in the modern world shifted and changed the axes. You know, some people have called this a hypermodernity, a shift to a late modernity. 20, 30 years ago, people were using the idea of a post-modernity. So what I want to suggest is that for me, this whole idea of liquidity works perhaps the best. And what I want to suggest to you now, that there are a number of features that we need to associate or bring to light when we start thinking about leisure, because all of these impact on how we think about leisure. So what I'm going to suggest to you, I'm going to explore this idea of liquid modernity very briefly, and then I'm going to explore these 13 different ways of looking at leisure that are influenced by this thought. So what I would suggest is, what Bauman suggests anyway, is that from the middle of the 20th century, modernity starts to shift. It changes. There's something qualitatively different about modernity. And and you might call these a number of revolutions, if you like, that start to occur in the middle of the 20th century. The first one, which some people like Agnes Eller have described as the revolution of everyday life. Something changes where self-emancipation comes to the forefront of people's minds. So no longer are people content to describe themselves in the way of the world in which they were born into. Something starts to change, and people start to see themselves first and foremost as individuals. Something else also changes. I think there's an almost what I would call a neoliberal, or other people have called as well, a neoliberal. Oh, thank you. Oh, is that better? Are you losing me? Yeah. I'm surprised at how loud my voice is anyway, but yeah, thank you. So a neoliberal modernity, a shift, a revolution. So capitalism comes to the forefront, if you like, in the time of industrial production. But what Bauman argues is, you know, from the middle of the sort of 20th century, neoliberalism, this sort of whole idea of the market and capitalism, starts to infiltrate and colonize other aspects of our lives in ways that we didn't know. You know, some people might argue, you know, from my experience of Britain, the university, you know, universities for me will always be the great seat of leisure, the great utopias, if you like, where we go into them and we think about things and we take time away to think at our leisure. But increasingly, neoliberal forces have started to colonize university worlds. They've started to use, some people might argue, Dr. Freud, Sigmund Freud, argued, you know, the whole idea of the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. Some, you know, theorists have argued that even the unconscious mind is increasingly infiltrated by neoliberal values, and these are everywhere. So market forces are everywhere these days. There are our leisure, they're in the ways that we consume and so forth. So that's the second major change. The third is, over the last 30, 40 years, our world, if you like, is increasingly, in the West and everywhere, become an age of extremes. Eric Hobsbawm, you know, the sort of great Marxist historian, argued that, you know, from the middle of the 20th century, he called it, he called the 20th century the short 20th century that sort of ended in the 1980s, according to him. But from that point, we start to see more and more extremes of wealth and inequality. And we see that on our streets all over the major cities of the world. And it's quite interesting that the work ethic that was introduced to us, during the Industrial Revolution, that shaped the way that we saw work. We all know that feeling, or a lot of us know that feeling of work dominating our lives and some influencing our leisure. But people like Bauman started to argue from the middle of the sort of 20th century, the only idea of the work ethic it emerges as a kind of ideology with which to punish the poor. Everybody else seems to be enjoying themselves, but the poor will be punished with the work ethic. The next change is that increasingly our lives are subjected to more and more individualization and privatization. Areas of life such as health, such as care, and so on and so forth, have increasingly and continue to be privatized more and more and individualized. Increasingly, life becomes much more uncertain, and our lives are more subjected to insecurity and uncertainty. With this security and uncertainty, I think there emerges this pervasive sense of nostalgia, if you like, for looking back towards what we used to have. I think Sveta Boym in his book looks at that whole idea of, with the end of the Soviet Union and all the freedoms it apparently gave, Russians today hark back to the days when it was the Soviet Union, because everything seemed a lot more organised and a lot more, and so on and so forth. So I would argue that a liquid modern world is one in which we see a pervasive sense of nostalgia, and that influences our leisure too. And the other important point that Bauman makes is that it's not so much, if we look back to the Industrial Revolution, it was work and industrial production that shaped our life choices, that shaped our leisure. And what I'd like to argue is that with consumerism replaces production as a way of life. Tony Giddens, the British sociologist, uses that apt term of lifting out the way in which all the industrial production that created all those jobs, dockers on shipyards, we used to build ships and cars and things, all those jobs have been lifted out and sent away to the east. And in most Western countries, we get assembly lines or new forms of work and so forth. But consumerism is what we do most. So that's a sort of background theme of liquidity, if you like. So what essentially Bauman's suggesting is that where life once seemed quite solid and fixed, and although a modern world is constantly in change and in flux, it didn't change as much as it does now. And it's as if we live in that hyper speeded up world where things are constantly changing, constantly in flux. What we do today disappears tomorrow, and so on. So no wonder we have this feeling of insecurity. Marriages aren't what they once were. Relationships aren't what they once were. Jobs certainly are. So there's this feeling of pervasive uncertainty, and that brings this sort of sense of nostalgia and so forth. So on the basis of that then, I'll stop turning my head because I'm realising now, sorry about this, that I'm going to look at 13 ways of exploring leisure. So you might look at these as standalone ideas, but I think as the lecture develops, you'll start to realise, I hope, that there's a number of connections between each. But first of all then, I'd like to argue that leisure, or a number of, not only I, but a number of leisure studies scholars have also made this point, that leisure is by and large conspicuous consumption, that more and more leisure has been turned into things. So you've probably come across the terms Merc-leisure or the McDonaldization of leisure. And the whole idea then that where leisure was once upon a time this free thing that we did, perhaps after work, becomes more and more about, consumption, and almost like a cultural competition for distinction between different groups. So, shall I bear it? Well, should I buy myself an iPhone, or should I buy a Samsung? Should I wear Nike trainers? Should I wear Adidas? This whole sort of notion, whatever leisure activity we see people involved in, it increasingly seems to involve some element of consumption. Wearing if you go to like the English Lake District, so people there are nominally going for recreation and climbing mountains and walks. But as you walk around the town of Keswick and you'll see people, wearing their Berghaus clothing or the alternative. So increasingly, the argument is that leisure is more and more consumption. So that's the first one. The second way of looking at leisure is that perhaps leisure, it must be seen as more and more control. And I want to talk a little bit here about Chris Rojek. As many of you will know, Chris Rojek has wrote many books on leisure. But his last major contribution to leisure studies, I think this book was published maybe about 2009, 2010. He called it, interesting, the labour of leisure. And I'll keep coming back to the cover of this book because it's quite important. But what Rojek argues is where once upon a time attaining just the right amount of competence, relevance and credibility was essential to be regarded as a valued worker. So I think he's talking about craft work here and work of responsibility. It is these very same attributes that are today what enable us to develop and nourish meaningful leisure lives. I think that's quite a radical statement, because what Rojek seems to be suggesting is that where once we needed competence, relevance and credibility to be good at our jobs, now we need those same competencies to be good at leisure. So it's as if Rojek gives up on leisure. He looks at leisure and he's almost saying to us, I think leisure has become increasingly consumerist. If we're going to rescue leisure, we need to become more like what valued workers once were. Because he realises that more and more jobs have become precarious, have become unskilled, have become without prospects, have been taken over by technology. But to enjoy our leisure lives and to have valued leisure lives, we need to learn the skills which were once the attributes of the workplace. And I think that's quite a radical thing. Sad, if he's right, but radical as well. But I think what Rojek overlooks is the point that capitalism appropriates key attributes of leisure. And we see this all the time. So things like immediacy, playfulness, subjectivity, performativity, all the things I'd associate with leisure are increasingly adopted by companies in the workplace. Come and work for Apple. You can play pool in the morning. You can go out. But the whole idea is that work is becoming increasingly playful. Now, is there something sinister going on there? I think so. But what's quite interesting and even sadder for me is, so Rojek, when he published this book, he used to be the senior editor at Sage Publications. So he took advantage a little bit. And if you read that book, you'll see pictures of birds on each page. And what Rojek concludes is that the one thing that we once said leisure was about, freedom, he argues freedom is only for the birds. The best we can do is get the skill set that used to inform us in the workplace, and if we do that, we might have a meaningful leisure life. I find that quite sad. So what I'd argue, that according to Rojek and other critics who see leisure as increasingly consumerist, is that and more about controlling us. So remember, they make work really playful, but to what extent And another one is, we could go on, couldn't we? We could go on about the pandemic, the way in which we got used to working at home. Oh, wasn't that wonderful? But the company inculcated and got itself into our living rooms, didn't it? And it got itself increasingly into our leisure time. So that's the other side of looking at that. So those are the first two ways I suggest we look at leisure. Now, the third one, I think what's really changed about leisure, and I borrowed this term from the great cultural studies, well, he was born, Richard Hoggart. He and I went to the same, he would have been 100 and something now, if you live, but I went to the same grammar school as him, and he came from the same area of Leeds and me, but he left us with this lovely saying, and he was talking about culture, and he says, culture is good of its own kind. And I think we need to think about leisure as good of its own kind, because what Rojek has done, I think, and critics that suggest that leisure is increasingly consumerist, what they seem to suggest to me is that there's something about leisure that's really, really, really important. You know, that there's something about true leisure is working for higher ends. But so what people like Rojek are saying is most people can't obtain that. So the best that they can do is become more work-like or whatever, the labour of leisure. But what I want to suggest is that when it comes to leisure, there's no one type of leisure that's better than any other. I think leisure can only be good of its own kind. I've said there, rather posh way, leisure, there are no ontologically superior concepts. What I'm suggesting is that in our world, just like there's been a collapse of that distinction between high and low culture, I think we need to understand leisure in that same way. And I give that example there. I've got that image of car cruising. I bet you have car cruising here, don't you? In the UK, car cruisers, they go in. So during the day, you'll go to your DIY store and you'll buy some wood and so forth. But as those places close down, all the young people drive their cars down there and they spin wheels and they race and do things like that. And society looks down on them and says, oh no, that's deviant activity. What I'm suggesting is that we should understand leisure under different categories. So if we're trying to look at car cruising as a category of leisure, it's a very different type of leisure activity than serious leisure volunteering. So that's the third way I suggest we need to look at leisure. Now, I think one of the most important ways of understanding leisure for me is leisure as freedom. And I don't think freedom's just for the birds. I think that leisure is something that's important to us. But like I was trying to give you an image of every concept that I look at. So if you go into Google Images, because this is another form of consumption, isn't it? We'll go onto Google and look for an image. So you put freedom in. 3 things essentially come up. The first one is the one that Rojek used. You've got the cage door open and birds are flying, so freedom is for the birds, according to that. The second one tends to be of 2 arms together like that with chains across, and the chains have been cut and they're free. Or the third one is somebody like Miley Cyrus with her latest tattoo that's telling us about freedom or whatever. But it's always a picture of a celebrity. That's another aspect of consumer culture I could have talked about. But we seem to look up to celebrities as cultural intermediaries these days and tell us what to do. So Miley sets the next fashion for tattooing or whatever. Tattooing in the UK is a female phenomenon, has just gone through the roof. And all these are translated. But anyway, that's another story. But I'd like to argue that leisure is, for me, always will be about freedom, but not in the way that Miley Cyrus understands it. And this is quite a long quote, and I've sort of cribbed part of it from the British philosopher Bernard Williams, but I think it's an important one. And I'll just read it through it. It seems to me that freedom is something like a demand for authenticity and self-realization. That's what freedom is for me. The idea that you live your life on the basis that there's a way of being in the world that is really you. And that there's a discovery to be made there involving trust and risk, which dovetails nicely with others like you and expresses what others like you and others like you are or are not. And I think that's important. What that suggests to me is that freedom's not an individual thing. Freedom is always a social relation. We always find freedom with others. And if anything, that's what leisure is to me. We find like people who make like choices like ourselves. You know, they're the people that we surf with, who know what riding waves is like. They're the people who dress like we do, who have the same music interests. That's what leisure is, and that sort of freedom. But there's something about leisure that when you're at your leisure, there's something that is really, really you. When I was young, people used to bump into them. The first thing they said to you, "What job do you do then?" Often you were quite embarrassed. I was, some of the jobs I did. I won't tell you what. Nothing rude, but I had some jobs anyway, and I always was embarrassed because at that point I was a builder's labourer or something like that, so I didn't know what to say. Now it's fine. I can say, "Oh, I'm a professor," and so that's quite different. However, I think increasingly people see themselves first and foremost through their leisure. Some people try to make a quite entrepreneurial. They love beer, so they get into the craft brewing industry. And they drink beer, and they love beer, but beer is part of their life. And I think this is increasingly what we try to do. Some of us can't. Some of us in horrible jobs with no prospects or whatever. But in our leisure, that's where we find freedom. So it's not for the birds. But we find it, you've got to remember, it's made with other people. It's always a social relation. I'll speed up now because we're only on number 4. Right. Number 5. Now, for me, when I was taught leisure, there was no mention of home. No mention of being somewhere that feels special. And do you know whose fault this is? Plato. And it goes back to the Greeks. And if you read the Timaeus, Plato talks about leisure. But there's one aspect of leisure he never talks about. And I'm going to keep coming back to this. But I would argue that for me, leisure is a home. And it's a choral experience. I'm going to explain that in more and more detail. I was going to put a slide up on this, but it wouldn't have been a good one. But basically, what Plato suggests, he talks in the Timaeus about this thing. He won't even name it. Jacques Derrida, the great French philosopher, wrote a book about this called Chora. But what he says is, Plato, he talks about this thing. He calls this thing a home. He calls it gold. He calls it the nurse of becoming. He uses all these metaphors to describe it. But what he's talking about, Derrida argues, is this thing called Chora. And I bet most of you in this room have had what I'd call a choral experience. Something like an epiphany. Something like at your leisure. I mean, Zizek Mihaly used to call it flow experience. But I think it's something much more important than flow. And I put a picture up of this place I live there. And that's one of my views. But the point is, it's at Scarborough. I'm writing a book about the seaside. But my first experience with the seaside was like one of these choral experiences. I went to the seaside as a young person, and I looked out towards the sunrise. And I looked at, and something connected with it. So every time I go back to the seaside, I have this feeling of home. I feel secure there. So for me then, and I'll come back to this in a moment, leisure for me is always about home. When I'm at leisure, when I'm really, really me and being myself. How many people here have been in a work situation and you think, this ain't me? I'm not going to do this forever. When I'm at my leisure and I'm really, really me, that's where I'm at home, because I'm with people who are like me and think like me and feel like me. And we have a language that we share. Surfers do, don't they? I don't surf, but I can imagine what that language is like. They look the same, they dress the same, they know what riding the waves means, so on and so forth. And you can apply that to any leisure form, I think. But there's a choral experience that when you first have it and you experience it, it's euphoric and you want it again. So you keep going back, going back. Okay then. My next way of looking at leisure is as a space of play. And I borrowed this idea from Walter Benjamin, or Benjamin, I should pronounce it properly, but Benjamin. And I think in this image, I think the idea is that he's having some sort of experience on drugs, or Benjamin used to take drugs. But what I think leisure is, this sixth way of looking at leisure, is it's a space of play. It's a world, there's an essential joy that informs leisure. Now, I've been critical of Chris Rojek. If you see him, don't tell him I've been critical of him. I was critical of his other book, but I'm going to be critical of his 85 book, Capitalism and Leisure Theory. And at the end of that book, he sets out some rules for understanding leisure. And do you know what he dares to say? He says, the play world is for children. Leisure world is for adults. And I've always had a problem with that distinction. For me, leisure is always a playful world. It's a space of play. And there's this sort of freedom that incarnates a world to play. We all know that from children, and hopefully we still know it today. There's something about us. And I'm borrowing this idea from Michel Foucault, another great French thinker. But what he argued is, in a different context, what I want to argue, borrowing his idea, is there's a sort of madness about leisure, isn't there? When we're at our leisure. And, this poem from Gabran, he says, when we're at our leisure, well, he doesn't talk about leisure. He said there's a freedom in loneliness for the madman. And there's a safety from being understood for the madman. And I think that's what leisure like. There's almost a madness that we want to create and do things in a different way. But also, there's the poet in us. We find safety in companionship. This is Stevens when he writes his poem. For me, he's suggesting if we need to think about the world of a blackbird, we need to think about it as a space of play. We need to think about it in a mad way. If you read his poem, you'll see what I mean. But we also need to think about it in a poetic way. So what I'm suggesting is, in our leisure, these two supreme talents, if you like, are dialectical in regard to one another. There's a sort of essential madness when we're at play, but also a kind of poetics, if you like. And it nourishes the one with the other. So that's my sixth way of describing leisure. Right, I better speed up now. Leisure is also, for me, a time space. I'm not the first person to argue this, but another great French thinker, Pierre Bourdieu, I'm so jealous. You can read all these people in French, and I have to have the translations, but I trust some of the translations. But what Bourdieu argued is that skole is, and this goes back to the Greeks, the early ways of thinking about leisure. So leisure is time lived without its flow. There's something about leisure time that is outside the world of normal time. There's something distinctive about leisure that enables us almost to put the handbrake on. We need to stop and think about leisure. And what Bourdieu argued, it frees us from the urgencies of the world to find a free and liberated relationship with that world. The trouble is, people like Bourdieu, a little bit like Rojek, think that's only for elite people. That most other people don't have time to think about leisure in that way. But I would argue that leisure time, that school, is something that those twin ideologies of neoliberalism, the work ethic and consumer culture, try to stop. The other way of looking about leisure is this core that keeps coming up again, is this preformed physical space. So it's something like, not like a container, but a space of becoming a homely place. So for me, I'm reiterating what I said separately in the previous slides, is that there's something about leisure. It's a space, it's somewhere we feel comfortable, and we are with other people like us, but it's in that space that we can feel free and be ourselves. So leisure as a time space. I would say this is another movement on that idea, is that leisure then we need to see as an ontological hybrid. I mean an actuality, a reality that's an hybrid of freedom and homeliness, or freedom and security. Zygmunt Bauman argues that the two greatest values of a modern society are, it gives us freedom and it gives us security. The trouble is, he sees freedom and security as at odds together. The more free we are, we lose security, so we become almost nostalgic for the security. But the more security we have, we feel hemmed in and we can't express ourselves. I think those two values in leisure aren't at odds with one another. They are, and in that oxymoron sort of sentence there, which I'm not going to read out, but I think what I'm trying to suggest is that freedom and security are bedfellows, not opposites. So we find freedom and home in our leisure, or freedom and belonging, however we want to put that. I'd also argue, increasingly, that freedom is the art of living. These do you have people called steampunks over here? There's a place near where I live called Whitby, and they've just had it, the Goth Weekend, and these people dress up. And our society, in many, many ways, is more and more about the art of living. We're not content. I'll tell you, about 30 years ago, I used to get on a train down to London from the north of England, and we're all a little bit unreconstructed in the north, or we were. And you go down to London, and you'd see people on the train with cowboy hats, dressed in all sorts of fantastic gear, you know, clothes that defied gender or whatever. And you used to think, whoa. I think that has become our world. People are not content just to live in one way. Increasingly, people express themselves. So Michel Foucault said, and it's the quote, the gist of the quote was this. He said, he pointed up at a portrait on a wall of a painting, and he says, why should painting be classed as art? Why can't art be a way of living? And Socrates said that as well, so it wasn't just Foucault. But the point is that I would say that art is fundamentally visual, and artworks have a range of functions, but two stand out. One's aesthetic. We produce things of artist merit in a self-disciplined way that promises to say yes to another group. On the other hand, when we make things that are artistic, we just don't make them for the fun of it. We want them to be admired, don't we? When we paint a painting, we want people to look at it and look for its hidden meaning and its depth to talk about. And I think that's what increasingly the art of living is about. People want to stand out, to turn themselves into objects of attention. I might talk about it again, so I'm going to talk about it now. It's coming to my head. But, you know, like slacklining, when they go across their massive gorges on those lines. So people say that's risky, that's stupid. It's not. It's highly trained. People work at that. They start on slow lines and build and build and build. But when they've done it, they're not content just to have done it and said, wow, I did that. They want to be admired for being slackliners. So you'll go online and they'll put them all on that. That is what the art of living is about. Number 10, and that here's your slackliner. She's there on the line. But I would argue that increasingly leisure is about a stage for performers, whether you're a slackliner, whether you're you're into punk, whatever. But it becomes a stage. And I would argue that in our society, increasingly, everyday public life has become dramaturgical, if you like. Irving Goffman talked about this, didn't he, in the 60s. But dramaturgy creates a new form of freedom, if you like. But I'd also suggest there's a little problem with that, because a neoliberal world celebrates that. Watchableness is what people want more and more in our society, to be admired for who they are. And I think this we've got to be careful with this one, because it has almost this new controlling effect on our behaviours. It's as if in our world, I wonder if anybody else feels like this, but I think this is the new feeling of our age. We've got this fear of not standing out, which is virtually the same as never having existed before. Go online. Am I online? I'm not online. What shall I do? What shall I do? It's as if that whole idea is that we need to stand out. We need recognition. And that has become almost what a performative society is about. And we see that in leisure. Ooh, pressed the wrong button. Right, I'm going to speed up now. 11, and a lot of this brings it all together. Now, leisure, I would argue, is a value sphere. The great German sociologist, Max Weber, talked about value spheres. And he named two important ones. He talked about law and science. And he said, value spheres are these places where we can express ourselves and build a vocation. And he was a sociologist, and he saw his vocation as sociology. I would argue that in our society, for me, leisure is an important value sphere. And I'm going to talk about surfing here a little bit. I'd argue value spheres are distinct realms of human activity involving existential choice. You choose to be a surfer, you choose to be a scientist, which have their own inherent dignity. There's something where you get your dignity from, that feeling of being part of something. There's also, you're making an existential leap, if you like, into a destiny. You're saying, I'm going to be a surfer. So there's discovery to be made there. You find that sense of exhilaration and self-expression. There's risk involved in surfing, isn't there? Are you going to make a fool of yourself to other people? Are you going to risk drowning? Are you going to risk that type of, and so on and so forth. There's also a sense of belonging. That's why you like it there. People speak the same language as you. They look the same as you. They're interested in the things that you're interested in. There's an hermeneutic tradition that gets, like I'm saying, an historical tradition that gets passed down. You know, what surfers did in the 60s. There's an informal education that goes with it. So these aren't new ideas, what leisure gives us. But I think seeing leisure as a value sphere does that. There's a form of gift exchange and pedagogy. There's a form of education that's going on. There's also politics. You know, you look at the surfing movement, it's massively political. I mean, we've got a massive problem in the UK with pollution. The private water companies are tipping all that, you know what, into the sea. And they're not supposed to do this, but they do with it, get away with it, because they only have small fines. They don't invest in water infrastructure. They just give money to their shareholders. So increasingly, what Surfers Against Sewage doing are bringing that to the forefront. That's where they have their leisure. Okay. Number 12, very quickly, I suggested earlier that leisure is also about, in a modern society, we live in a nostalgic world. And I think increasingly, we look back to the past in our leisure. You know, the continuities of life that we once took for granted start to fragment. You know, the jobs for life have disappeared. Things have started to disappear. But retrotopia, this is one of Bauman's last books, is that's our response to these conditions. You know, he argues that the past is almost like a vast utopian space that we mine. and and it's a dream world. Again, space of play. So when we look to retrotopia, we look back to a place, Cora again. We look back to a time, and we try to find that and recreate it in our leisure. And the market helps us, doesn't it? That's what the heritage industry is all about, isn't it? Dealing with that sort of nostalgia and offering it to us. But I would argue that retrotopians become almost obsessed by absence, obsessed by what's missing. There's a sort of melancholy. Melancholy is a lovely word, but melancholy is that feeling of something missing and we can't find it. We want it. And that comes with nostalgia. But there's something about retrotopia. And if I've been researching the seaside in England for the last 3 years, and that to me is what the seaside is today. You go to the seaside, nothing seems to change. The old Victorian buildings, it's a bit like, the old town in Montreal. All the buildings are still there. People are on the beach making sandcastles. It's wonderful. It seems like it's 1955, except the prices aren't the same, and you're paying a lot for a coffee and a beer. But the essential fact is, in our leisure, we arc back to the past more and more. Is that not what steampunk is? It's like the past hits the future and coalesces in steampunk. I don't know. And the last way of looking at leisure I want to give you is that I see increasingly leisure as being this massive archipelago, if you like, of heterotopias. Michel Foucault gave us this idea. And what Michel Foucault suggested is that heterotopias are different to utopias. Utopia's always in the future. It's always something we never reach. I'd argue in leisure we find utopia all the time, but we don't find it with everybody, this grand utopia. We find it with people like us who look for the same things. And it's in those space places. Foucault was talking about heterotopias of deviance. Do you have a thing called dogging here? I have to put something rude into a lecture. Dogging, not a word. I'll tell you what dogging is. Shia. Well, in the UK, people go into car parks on a night and have sex with strangers they've never met before, and it's called dogging in the UK. And they go, but they get that existential thrill about meeting up with and having sex with. Some people look down on that, think it's amoral, but again, everybody to their own thing from my point of view. However, what I'm suggesting is leisure is full of these heterotopias, that people do things with like people, like themselves. But in all of those places, we find different kinds of becoming, new ways of being in the world, where you can be free and completely at home. Now that's, for me, I'm just going to finish there. That is, to me, what leisure is all about, ultimately. We find freedom and we find home and we bring them together. Thank you for listening.